Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for the first video of this year's mystery week for Halloween. I do this every single year. In the run up to Halloween, I post a video every single day for a week. You may have noticed though, actually this video is not a mystery video, this is a history video. So I've actually been calling this my mystery history week. I just thought it would be fun to do a couple of Halloween themed history videos in this week as well. So I hope you enjoy. Every single day for the next 7 days up until Halloween there'll be a video going up at 4:30 p.m. So if you want to make sure you're notified right away, make sure you're subscribed to my channel first of all and click the little bell icon so you'll get a little notification on your phone pop up when I post. So to kick off this week leading up to Halloween, I'm starting with one of the most apt pieces of history for this time of year, the Salem witch trials. This is yet another piece of history that's been retold again and again throughout the years, a story twisted and changed with each retelling. Chinese whispers. Contrary to popular belief, no witches were actually burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials. If I'm going to be completely honest, up until just a few months ago, my full understanding of the Salem witch trials came from The Crucible by Arthur Miller. It's a classic, it's one of my favourite plays of all time, it's one of my favourite scripts of all time, but shockingly, it's not exactly historically accurate. But before we get into this video, I'd like to thank Magellan TV once again for sponsoring this video. Me and Magellan are working together on a longer term basis. I really like what they offer and I hope that you guys do as well. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming site with hundreds of documentaries about a huge range of different topics. I love documentaries and if you're watching this video, I'm sure you do too. I really cannot recommend Magellan TV enough. They have everything from true crime to science, history, nature and everything in between. New programmes are added weekly that can be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop and mobile. It's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and loads of the programmes are available in 4K. I always like to give you a couple of documentary recommendations at the end of this, so the two documentaries I'm going to recommend for you this week are You Racist?, which is a scientific look as to whether somebody is subconsciously racist and the effect that that has on society, and it's actually really fascinating. And the other one that I have liked this week is Tails You Win, The Science of Chance. As I film this, I'm going to Las Vegas in a few days and I wanted to see if I could learn something I could possibly use. I'll let you know how that one goes. I had a very sciencey documentary week this week apparently. I have to start this story with a little bit of context, otherwise it's not really going to make much sense. Salem isn't the first place in the world that had this hysteria around witches, nor was it the last. It's just the most famous. The belief of witches actually emerged in Europe as early as the 14th century, and the witches they referred to are not the same as what we consider to be witches today. We either picture the Halloween costumes with the brooms and the black cloaks and the hooked noses, or we refer to Wicca. Sometimes practicing Wiccans refer to themselves as witches, but one can be a witch without being Wiccan and vice versa. That's not the kind of thing I'm referring to when I talk about witches in the context of the Salem witch trials. Society around New England at the time was incredibly religious. In the lead up to this over in actual England, Puritanism had been on the rise for a while. Puritans were people who were opposed to many of the traditions of the Anglican Church of England, which they believed was too influenced by the Catholic Church. King Charles I was not happy with this viewpoint of them criticising the church, and church officials tried to repress these Puritan views. As a result, Puritans sought refuge elsewhere, many migrating to colonial North America, where they established their own society. They would migrate over to America in groups. Often entire Puritan congregations would leave England led by their ministers and settle in New England. So therefore, pretty much all of New England, which we now know is part of the USA, was strongly Puritan. Their faith was literally the centre of everything. The men who led society, the colonial leaders, were elected based purely on how good a Puritan they were. Puritans believed strongly in heaven and hell. Only the best of the best would be allowed into heaven, the majority would end up in hell. In the simplest terms, Puritans sought to reform themselves and society by purifying their churches of all Roman Catholic teachings. The heart of Puritanism was to transform society by making God's will one's own. People following Puritanism would lead an exemplary life led by God, which would then in turn persuade others to do the same. That was the general idea of it anyway. Puritans believed that God had formed a unique covenant with them. These were deeply religious, God-fearing people who followed the scripture. They lived a strict and rigid way of life, and there was very little individuality. Puritan society was very carefully regulated. Everything from how people dressed to how often they attended church to how much attention they paid to how piously they lived life was analysed by the leaders. Puritans believed that the devil was at every single turn, that the devil was as equally present in the world as God was, and the devil was there to try and convince people to veer off the path of God. Which is kind of where witches come in here. So under Puritan society, being disobedient without repentance meant that you were a follower of the devil, and therefore all of your actions reflected the devil's will. If you sinned because the devil was in you, and that is what made you a witch. And being a witch was punishable by death. So basically you're looking at a hyper religious society who believe that if they don't follow God's words like to the T, they're going to end up in hell. And not only have they got to follow God's word, they've got to make sure that they're not susceptible to the devil in any way. These people were so religious that they were almost scared of religion in a way, if that makes sense. But of course there's some gender context here as well. The Puritan belief was that women were inherently sinful and more susceptible to the devil than men were, because apparently female bodies were weaker and therefore their souls were unprotected. I mean, would it really be a history video without a little bit of misogyny? So females had to work twice as hard as men to thwart the devil. They had to live life perfectly according to the scripture, otherwise they were a witch. Puritans said that women were equal in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the devil. So they're basically living life on the expectation that women around them would be taken over by the devil if they didn't live 100% according to the scripture. If the women did anything that the men/religious leaders didn't like or didn't sort of approve of, they could be accused of witchcraft. For example, just arguing with a neighbour could incite allegations of witchcraft. Prior to 1692, there had been lots of rumours of witchcraft in the neighbouring communities around Salem, and it was very much something that was on people's minds. From the 1300s through to the end of the 1400s, tens of thousands of witches, mostly women, had been executed throughout Europe. The Salem hysteria actually came as the craze was dying down in Europe. But why did it start in Salem around then? So in 1689, joint English rulers William and Mary started a war with France in the American colonies, which caused a huge displacement of people. It sent refugees into Essex, which was the county in which Salem was found on the coast. Many of these refugees ended up in Salem, and this placed a huge strain on the village's resources. They just couldn't provide for everyone, and it also aggravated existing sort of feuds between the wealthier families of the town, who were already quarrelling over the port and the agriculture and the church. So people are already just like a little bit annoyed about the way their lives are going. And a lot of the context around the witch hunt probably actually revolves around this struggle they had to get a church in Salem village. People had to travel to Salem town to attend church, which was a 10-mile round trip, and they had to do that at least once a week, if not more. A lot of people wanted to be released from the town church and be allowed to build their own church in the village. And this led to a lot of arguments between the people who were living closer to the town and were happy to continue going to that church, and the ones who lived further away and wanted a new church in the village. And this was particularly between two powerful families in the village, the Putnams and the Porters. At the heart of the trials that were to come, there was this huge feud between these two families that dragged the rest of the people living in the village, about 600 people, into the middle of it. There would literally be quarrels in the street between random people over which side they took. So Salem at this point was kind of a divided society. And just on top of all of this society that's already sort of like teetering on the brink, there was also a lot of controversy over Salem village's first appointed minister, a Reverend Samuel Parris, who had been ordained in 1689. He was generally disliked in the village because he was particularly rigid about his beliefs, but he was also very greedy, which kind of goes against everything he preached. He was a bit of a hypocrite, and he generally just wasn't that well liked. And the Puritan villagers came to believe that all of this unrest and arguing and all of this just like unhappiness in the village was the work of the devil, that the devil was causing them to all turn against one another. Which leads us into what happened next. In January 1692, Reverend Paris's 9-year-old daughter Elizabeth, who was known as Betty, and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams started having fits. They screamed, they threw things, they made strange sounds, and they contorted themselves into strange positions. It was completely uncontrollable. They complained that their skin was being pricked with pins. And this goes on for, I think, a couple of weeks before a local doctor, a William Griggs, is called. And he gives a very medical diagnosis of bewitchment, saying that they were under the affliction of an evil hand, as he couldn't find any physical evidence of ailment. And this was kind of the norm at the time. If a doctor was called to a patient and the doctor couldn't tell you what was wrong with that patient, which was quite a lot of the time, the doctor would more often than not be like, oh yeah, they're bewitched, it's the work of the devil, and that would be that. Within a few weeks, these first two girls beginning to act very strange, other girls in the village became afflicted with the same. There was 12-year-old Anne Putnam and 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard. Now, Elizabeth was actually the great niece of William Griggs's, the doctor's wife, Rachel Hubbard Griggs. Now, Elizabeth had become detached from her parents and been sent to live with the Griggs in Salem, but they didn't treat her as a daughter of sorts. Elizabeth was actually kind of made to be a servant of the household. I actually read what is said to be an eyewitness account of the girls' behaviour written by a former minister, Reverend Deodat Lawson. It's entitled A Brief and True Narrative of Some Remarkable Passages Relating to Sundry Persons Afflicted by Witchcraft at Salem Village, which happened to be from the 19th of March to the 5th of April 1692. A very snappy name for this sort of written essay, I suppose. And it was actually a really fascinating read. It was written at the time by somebody who had actually witnessed how these girls were behaving, so it does give you a very interesting insight as to what was going on. I'll read you a small excerpt from it. When I was there, his kinswoman, Abigail Williams, had a grievous fit. She was at first hurried with violence to and fro the room, sometimes making as if she would fly, stretching her arms up as high as she could, and crying, wish, 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 several times. She said, do you not see her? Why, there she stands. And she said Goodwin offered her the book, but she was resolved she would not take it. You'll hear a lot of references in this video to the book, and this refers to the Devil's Book. A lot of these girls would say that they're basically offered the Devil's Book to sign, basically signing over their soul to the devil. So you hear a lot of references to the book throughout this video. So Lawson carries on writing, saying that she was resolved that she would not take it, saying often, I won't take it. I do not know what book it is. I'm sure it is none of God's book. It is the Devil's Book. For I ought to know. After that, she ran to the fire and began to throw firebrands about the house and run against the back as if she would run up the chimney. And as they said, she had attempted to go into the fire in other fits. So this is an 11, 12-year-old girl, Abigail Williams, acting this way. She's acting as if the devil has come to her. Apparently on some occasions she's tried to run into the fire and they've had to hold her back to stop her. She's convulsing, she's screaming, she's trying to fly, she's being very violent and running across the room. It's a very strange account. A few days after witnessing this, Lawson would go on to hold a public service, a public worship. And the girls would attend this worship and they would constantly interrupt his services with their outbursts. And of course, people were looking for answers as to why these young girls were acting this way. It was clearly the devil, but why these girls? Over the next few months, many more girls would become afflicted with whatever this was. And it's important to understand that the community didn't think that these afflicted girls were witches themselves. They thought that there were witches in the community who were making the devil affect these girls. They tried everything to cure them, aka they tried to pray, and then they tried to pray again, and then they tried to pray again, which shockingly didn't work, but they didn't have much else to do. One day the girls, Betty and Abigail, are left in the care of a Mary Sibley, who was a neighbour of the Parises, and she instructs Samuel Paris's slaves, Tituba and John, to make something called a witch cake. When I was taught the crucible in school, I was taught to pronounce Tituba as Tituba. But watching a lot of documentaries on this, sometimes it's pronounced Tituba. But when I say Tituba, it just sounds like I'm trying to put on a bad American accent. So I'm going to carry on saying Tituba, because that's how I was taught to say it, but that may be wrong. I just want to clear the air there. So Mary Sibley, like I said, instructed Tituba and John to make something called a witch's cake. Now, a cake is a loose description of this, but basically it should have revealed whether witchcraft was involved in how the girls were acting. It was something called white magic. Witches' cakes were little cakes made from rye meal and the urine from the afflicted girls, and it was to be fed to a dog. According to English folklore, when the dog ate the cake, the witch that was afflicting the girls would be hurt. That should have been the general idea of it, but of course it didn't work, and when Samuel Parris found out that Mary Sibley was using white magic, she was actually denounced from the church herself. Reverend Parris actually denounced her, called her out in front of the entire congregation, calling it going to the devil for help against the devil. It didn't matter that it was white magic, not black magic. It was still bad. And that's kind of the last record of Mary Sibley throughout the trials. Her story kind of ends there. At the end of February 1692, the afflicted girls have accused 3 women of witchcraft: Tituba, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, and arrest warrants are issued for all 3. The girls said that these are the 3 women who are responsible for how they're acting. Now, Tituba is a name that obviously you've already heard. She was the slave of the Parris family. She was most likely originally from the West Indies, and it's likely that she became a target in this because she was an easy target. She was already a slave, the lowest class, and she was of a different ethnicity. Some sources suggest that Tituba allegedly practiced voodoo and taught the village girls fortune telling, which was 2 big no-nos in Puritan society. But this is probably just a rumour though, as there's no references to this in any court records. Sarah Good was another easy target. She was a poor beggar, she was likely homeless, she was pregnant, and she would walk around Salem knocking on doors begging for money. And in Puritan eyes, this made her immoral. She didn't follow the crowd, she didn't conform, she didn't fit into society. She didn't follow the word of God, otherwise she wouldn't be poor is how they saw it. So again, Sarah Good is an easy one to accuse. And then there's Sarah Osborne, who was simply just a bad Puritan. There'd been a lot of drama surrounding Sarah, as her husband had died prematurely and left her with his land, on the provision that when their 2 sons came of age, they would get the land. Soon after her husband's death though, Sarah hires an indentured Irish immigrant to work with them as a farmhand. And soon Sarah begins living with this Irish immigrant before marrying him. She then attempts to overtake her children's inheritance and take the land for herself and her new husband. And this becomes a very lengthy legal battle. And on top of all of this, she just never attended church. Her legal battle lasted until 1692, which is just when she happened to be accused of witchcraft. Each one of these was considered to be a social outcast, and all 3 are quickly arrested and brought before the local magistrate's court, and they're interrogated for days straight. This is the first of the Salem witch trials. But in a shocking turn of events, Tituba actually confessed to being a witch. The trials may have ended with those 3 had Tituba not made her remarkable confession, which struck fear in the leaders of the church. It was this that convinced the people of Salem that this was not an isolated incident, that the devil had indeed invaded the village. Tituba is recorded as saying, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." But the extent to which she confessed actually differs from source to source. Apparently she spoke about how the devil ordered her to hurt the children, how the animals, dogs, hogs, cats, foxes and wolves acted as her familiars. She spoke of riding sticks to different places, something we actually still think of as witchcraft today. She spoke of a tall, dark man who wanted her to sign his book, and she did so. She pretty much said anything that would send the leaders into a frenzy, completely confused their idea of witchcraft as they understood it. She also started to accuse other women in Salem of witchcraft herself. But this was actually kind of a smart move, because it was actually this confession that kept her alive, or at least the fact that she pretended to have conferred with the devil and therefore she knew who else was a witch. She shared these tidbits of information as and when she wanted, and this is pretty much what kept her alive throughout the trials. The leaders saw her as like somebody they could actually ask outright, and she would speak very openly about her career, for lack of a better word, as a witch. Or it has actually been suggested in multiple accounts that Tituba later confirmed that Samuel Parris had beaten this confession out of her and told her what to say when she was interrogated in the trial. So this may not have been something Tituba wanted to do at all, but something that Samuel Parris made her do. But regardless, Tituba, by confessing, planted the seeds of paranoia in Salem, and it became a snowball effect. Accusation after accusation followed for the next few months, with Tituba, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne in jail. Had Tituba never confessed, then the leaders never would have had confirmation that witchcraft was actually a real thing. All they could do was speculate and accuse. But because Tituba confessed, in their heads it meant that they were right, there was something darker, the devil was in Salem. In March, a woman called Martha Corey is accused of witchcraft. She was an upstanding member of the community. She was a devout Puritan. She did everything right. But she was accused by the girls, and the accusation was as good as proof to the leaders of Salem. They didn't need actual evidence. But if Martha Corey could be a witch, then anyone could be. Rebecca Nurse is another who is also accused. She is an upstanding citizen herself. Sarah Good's child, she was 4 years old, called Dorothy Good, was accused after she was interrogated by local magistrates. And apparently this 4-year-old girl confessed and claimed she'd seen her mother consorting with the devil. A 4-year-old. Dorothy was actually released from prison 9 months later, but she was a 4-year-old who spent 9 months in prison for witchcraft. No one was immune from the accusations. Over the coming weeks, more and more people are arrested. Sarah Cloyce, who was the sister of Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Proctor, Abigail Hobbs, Bridget Bishop, Mary Warren, Deliverance Hobbs, and even a man, Giles Corey, Martha Corey's husband. As there's more accusations, there's more girls being afflicted and therefore more girls to accuse other people, and it was literally just this snowball effect. On May 27, 1692, the governor ordered the establishment of a special court of oia and termina, which means to hear and to decide. This court was made purely for the witch trials. The first case brought to the court was that of Bridget Bishop. She was an older woman who was known for being a bit of a gossip, and she wore odd costumes, which is enough for somebody to be a witch according to the Puritans. When asked in court if she committed witchcraft, she responded, "I am as innocent as the child unborn." Regardless, she is found guilty, and on June 10th becomes the first person to be hanged. But after this, the court is adjourned for 20 days whilst it sought advice from New England's most influential ministers. They basically wanted to check with these ministers that what they were doing was okay, they were okay to be hanging witches. But the response comes written by a man called Cotton Mather. And this general gist of this response was, well, we need to be careful of the consequences of our actions, and spectral evidence should not be allowed, but also the devil is evil and witches are evil, so kind of carry on. There was a lot of debate over the coming months as to whether spectral evidence should be allowed in court, which was evidence in the form of dreams and visions. Basically, any girl could get up and say, I had a dream that this person is a witch, this person came to me in a dream, and the leaders would literally take that as gospel. Some people said that it's not evidence because obviously people could just make it up. Others said that that's exactly what the devil would say. So the court ignored the request to dismiss spectral evidence and they carried on anyway. There was only one person who publicly condemned these proceedings from the start, a man called Major Nathaniel Stoltenstall, who actually resigned from the court in the middle of June after the first hanging, because he knew straight away, like, this is bad, but the rest of them carried on. On the back of this letter being received, the trials started again on the 30th of June. Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howell, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds and Rebecca Nurse all go to trial and they're all found guilty of witchcraft. All 5 were hanged on July 19th, 1692. The hill on which they and many others would be hanged became known as Gallows Hill. Sarah Good's trial was particularly interesting, it seems, because there was no actual evidence of any crime presented during this trial. And during the trial, one of the young girls, one of the accusers, was even caught in a lie when she claimed that Sarah's evil spirit had just stabbed her with a knife. Like, there and then, Sarah's evil spirit had stabbed her. Apparently she was sat in the room and suddenly cried out that Sarah had stabbed her, and she pulls this broken knife blade out from under her dress. But then a young man in the courtroom stands up and says that he had actually broken that knife the previous day and he'd thrown away the blade, and he actually produced the remaining part of the knife from his pocket. This girl had obviously just seen him throw away his blade and had picked it up and hidden it in her dress to use the next day. But this girl was simply just warned not to lie in the courtroom, and the case continued. Even this didn't alert the leaders that something was going on and that they were probably lying. There was such a tunnel vision. It didn't matter if there was any evidence. It was about control. It was about trying to purify this village of what, I'm not entirely sure. But these people were just so scared of witches. Sarah was found guilty and, like I said, was hanged. But at least they waited for her to give birth to a child in jail who died shortly after birth, because these jails that they kept these accused witches in were disgusting. They were literally wet, they were dark, there were no windows, they were barely fed, there were rats. It was gross. And bear in mind, I said a 4-year-old girl was kept in one of these jails. Over the next couple of months, the trials continue and more people are arrested. On August 19th, 5 more people are executed, 4 of whom were actually men. Very often, the men who were accused of being witches in this trial were actually accused by neighbours who had long-standing resentments of them. It became a great way for people to cleanse the village of the people they just simply didn't like. And seeing as there was no actual evidence required, it was pretty easy to accuse. Anyone believed the accusers. One of the men who was arrested was John Proctor. Now, the initial accusations were actually aimed at John's wife, Elizabeth Proctor. But when he began to defend her and express his disbelief in the accusers, he basically said that his wife's not a witch and the girls were making it up. He gets accused himself by Abigail Williams. He was also named by Mary Walcott, who was another afflicted girl, who stated that his spirit had tried to choke her. He was also accused by his former servant, Mary Warren, who said that he'd forced her to touch the devil's book. It seems like once one person accused somebody, everyone else would jump on the bandwagon and say the same thing. John Proctor speaks out about his disbelief in the spectral evidence. He says that it's simply not evident. Elizabeth was pregnant and she was given a reprieve until she gave birth, and she did end up surviving. All in all, 12 members of the extended Proctor family were accused. John Proctor actually had a long-running feud with a neighbour, a man called Giles Corey, who'd actually filed a lawsuit against John when he started accusing him of setting fire to his house. Giles's case in this trial is incredibly interesting and heartbreaking. So his wife, Martha Corey, is one of the first women arrested, and Giles was so swept up in the hysteria that he actually believed the accusations. He started to believe his wife was a witch. He was fueled by the fire. But this kind of backfired a little bit though when he was arrested himself for witchcraft after Abigail Hobbs accused him, saying that the apparition of Giles had appeared to her and urged her to write in the book, beating her and breaking her back. And Giles refused to plead guilty or not guilty, which according to the law at the time meant that a person could not be tried. If you didn't plead, you couldn't be tried. I think his refusal to plead was actually something to do with his land. If he pled either way, eventually his land would be taken off him and given to the government, and his sons would be left with nothing. So he refuses. But there was a workaround for the courts if somebody ever refused to plead. Whilst they couldn't legally try him, they could legally torture him into giving a plea. So Giles Corey was stripped naked and a heavy board was placed on top of his body. Rocks were placed on the board more and more and more by the day until eventually he's crushed to death. Records say that throughout all of this, he still refused. He refused to give a plea. Each time he was asked, he would simply reply, "More weight." He eventually dies under the weight, but still in full possession of his estate, which was passed on to his sons-in-law as his will requested. The afflicted girls, the accusers, would sit in on the trials as they happened. They would accuse people's spirits of affecting them as they sat there. They would scream and contort and cry out in pain in the courtroom, or they would sit there in a trance-like state, staring ahead of them and unable to speak. Elizabeth Hubbard was a particular driving force behind these accusations. She was the oldest of the girls at 17. They were all there, they were doing the same thing, but Elizabeth testified against 29 people in total, 17 of whom were arrested, 13 of them were hanged, and 2 of them died in jail. That's a lot of deaths that a 17-year-old girl is responsible for. Most of the time Elizabeth would sit there sort of staring straight ahead, sort of in a trance, unable to speak. But when she could speak, she would pretty much always charge the accused with the same thing. She'd say that an apprehension of them appeared to her and they tortured her, and several times since has afflicted me and urged me to write in their book. The court didn't need any actual evidence. The fact that these girls were acting so and saying so was enough. These girls have been raised to be good Puritans, to only speak when spoken to be quiet, to be courteous. So for them to be acting so, it must be the work of the devil. I'll delve into this a little bit more later. But there were actually other tests that could be conducted to determine if somebody was a witch. There were the witch's cakes that I mentioned earlier in the video, the rye mixed with the urine of the afflicted girl, which was then fed to a dog. When the dog ate it, the witch who caused the affliction would sort of be in pain. 2 dogs are actually also accused of witchcraft in the trials, by the way, and they were killed, 2 dogs. And then there was also something called the touch test. If the accused touched the victim whilst the victim was having one of their fits and the fit stopped, the accused was the one who had clearly afflicted the victim. But of course this could just be decided by the free will of the afflicted girl. The logic was that when the witch touched the victim, their venom would go back into the witch and it would stop having its effect. And not at all that the girl just decided to stop acting that way. There's some other things as well. If there were non-Puritan items found in a home, it meant they're a witch. Books or horoscopes or pots of ointments or herbs that weren't Puritan, somebody could be accused. There was also the witch's teat, which were raised marks on the body which would be painful to the touch. Basically, if you had a mole or a 3rd nipple and you flinched when somebody touched it, you're a witch. All in all, the trials lasted through to the middle of 1693, although the hysteria had kind of slowed down around October the year before, and the accusations started to become fewer and further between. In October, the son of Cotton Mather, the man who sort of first implored the court to not allow the spectral evidence, denounced the use of spectral evidence himself. He was actually called Increase Mather. Increase Mather was the president of Harvard and said it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person be condemned. The governor, William Phipps, who had been the one to create the special court of Hoya and Terminer in the first place, suddenly decides to listen to Increase Mather. It was actually probably more a response to his own wife being questioned for witchcraft as well. But from then on, Phipps prohibits further arrests and releases many of the accused witches. He dissolves the court of Hoya and Terminer on October 29th and replaces it with a superior court of judicature, which disallowed spectral evidence. The trials then continue on through that court, but from that point onwards, only 3 out of 56 people who were tried for witchcraft over the coming months were found guilty, a huge difference from the 100% before. By May 1693, the governor had pardoned all those who were in prison on witchcraft charges. But that didn't change the fact that 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill. Giles Corey had been crushed to death, at least 4 people had died in jail due to the horrific conditions they were kept in. Little 4-year-old Dorothy Good had been traumatised for life. Her father said that she was never the same again. And over 200 people had been accused of practising the devil's magic, tainting their name forever in a society where status was everything. All of this based on spectral evidence, the court allowing dreams and visions to be actual evidence. Over the coming years, many people involved in the trials confessed error and guilt, and they started to repent. The Puritans recognised the error of their ways on what was known as the Day of Official Humiliation, which was held on January 15th, 1697, a day to plead with God for his forgiveness. But it actually took many years for the government to officially reverse many of the witchcraft convictions. Even though the trials ended, there were still lots of people who had been legally declared witches, which probably wasn't the best for them trying to get into heaven. In 1702, the trials were officially declared to have been unlawful. Petitions were filed to get the convictions overturned, and finally in 1711, 22 people had their judgments reversed. Later that same year, the new governor authorised monetary compensation for all 22 people who'd had their status reversed. And it took the state of Massachusetts more than 250 years to formally apologise for the events that took place. But the question remains, why did these trials even take place at all? Because I think we can pretty much all probably agree at this point that these girls, the accusers, were likely not afflicted by the devil. Not to say they were all faking their symptoms. In fact, a lot of historians believe they weren't faking at all. But it probably wasn't the devil that caused it. But there's no one answer as to why all of this happened. It seems to be an amalgamation of a variety of different societal, religious and political factors that just formed into this one huge tragic event. It was the perfect storm, a unique mixture of conditions that led to this outcome. You've got to remember that this all started in the home of the minister Samuel Parris with his daughter and niece. There would have been a lot of pressure and expectations in that household at the time, as there would have been in any Puritan family, but particularly when you're the daughter of the minister. Children would speak only when spoken to. They had to honour their mother and their father. They were expected to be obedient. They had to be silent. No music or dancing was allowed. No toys, no playing. They were to honour God, wear modest clothing, read the scripture. Girls would have been pretty well educated in Massachusetts at the time compared to other places because they were expected to be able to read the Bible. They would have been taught to read from an early age, but not to write. Only the boys would have been able to write. There were huge expectations on these girls. And they would have been constantly fed stories of the devil, of how if they didn't exactly follow God's word, then the devil would lure them to him. They likely would have lived in constant fear of the devil. And these were children. It started with a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. Maybe Betty had a tantrum about something or other. Maybe it was suggested to her that the devil was within her because she was having this tantrum, and then she just runs with it. But when the other girls in the village see the power that this is having over the entire community, finally this young girl has some power, has a say, they join in. Was it simply a prank taken too far? Were teenagers rebelling against their strict, authoritative parents? These girls would have had no power in society. As I mentioned earlier, men thought that the women were weak, more susceptible to the devil, and therefore they had to live entirely by the rules. Speak when spoken to, obey your father or your husband, read the Bible. That was it. But finally these girls started to have a voice. Perhaps they just liked having the power. Perhaps as children they didn't realise the effect that their actions would have. Maybe they were bored, they wanted something to do. But what I find more interesting is that even in the trials when people are being sentenced to their deaths, these girls are still having these fits, screaming out in trance-like state. Did it just get away from them? Did they not realise the sort of effect their actions would have and then they were too scared to back down? Or did they get too much enjoyment out of finally having a little bit of power? Or was it actually something else entirely? A lot of people suspect that this was just another case of mass hysteria. It was hysterical based on just the events alone. People became swept up in this witch hysteria, throwing accusations left, right and centre. But when I say mass hysteria, I refer to the psychological condition. I actually covered mass hysteria in detail in my case on the dancing plague of 1517, which happened in Europe over 150 years prior to the witch trials. I would highly recommend you go watch it if you want even more context on this. The definition I found of mass hysteria on dictionary.com is a condition affecting a group of persons characterised by excitement or anxiety, irrational behaviour or beliefs, or inexplicable symptoms of illness. Is it possible that the afflicted girls could have just been affected by mass hysteria? Not understanding what was happening to them or why they were acting the way they were surrounded by adults who were telling them that it's the work of the devil. And so they believe it. They start to accuse anyone who they believe is a bad Puritan, anyone who could be causing them to act this way because they don't understand it themselves. Or could they have been fed names by higher-ups as to who to accuse next? If mass hysteria can cause hundreds of people to take to the streets of Strasbourg in the 1500s and make them dance, flail their limbs in the streets until they literally collapse from exhaustion, it could probably cause a lot of very impressionable preteen and teenage girls to convulse and have fits. Actually, most cases of mass hysteria involve teenage girls. And then there's another theory, the ergot poisoning, which is another theory I talk about in detail in my Dancing Plague video. In 1976, an article was published in a scientific journal that proposed that ergot may have caused the symptoms the afflicted girls suffered from. Ergot is a fungus that infects rye and creates a byproduct known as ergotamine. Nowadays we know it as LSD. Living in Salem, a large amount of their diet would have been bread made from rye, and an infected batch may have caused the symptoms that they saw in the girls. It can cause a number of different effects, but usually manifests itself in one of two ways. There's either gangrenous ergotism, which involves the burning of the skin, blisters, and of course gangrene, which is basically where your extremities rot and fall off. This usually leads to death, especially in the 1600s. And then there's convulsive ergotism, which attacks the central nervous system. It can cause mania, psychosis, hallucinations, paralysis, pricking sensations, and convulsions. These girls often complained of feeling as if they were being pricked with needles, and it's well documented that their bodies convulsed. For a little while, this was the accepted version of events of the Salem witch trials. These girls simply had ergot poisoning and the religious society just assumed it was the devil. But this was actually debunked very soon after the paper was first published. The convulsive ergotism that was speculated that the girls would have been suffering from was typically most common in areas where people had a lack of vitamin A in their diet. But Salem was a coastal town / village, and their diets would have been quite heavy in seafood. And what is seafood full of? Vitamin A. Therefore it's likely, although not impossible, that ergot poisoning was the cause of their actions. Plus, after the initial convulsions and actions in their home, the girls actually seemed to be perfectly healthy throughout the trials for the most part, except when they're in the courtroom. You can't just choose when to suffer with this type of poisoning. A theory that I find particularly interesting is the connection the events may have had to the period of cold weather in the winter beforehand. Throughout history, most of the periods of intense witch persecution tended to correlate with periods of bad weather. It's theorised that it stemmed from the Christian belief that witches / the devil were able to control the weather and therefore destroy crops. So when people went hungry because of the cold weather destroying that year's crops, it had to be the work of witches. And Salem had had a particularly bad winter that previous year, and every year before that, and after. In fact, there was a 50-year cold spell which happened from 1680 to 1730, and the witch trials just happened in the midst of that. And then of course there's a possibility that the patriarchal leaders of Salem just used the way the girls were acting as another means to persecute the women who didn't act the way they wanted them to act. Maybe it was ergot poisoning, maybe it was mass hysteria, maybe they were just playing a prank. But the accusations started with women, slaves, beggars, the ones who didn't act according to the Bible, according to how the Puritan leaders wanted them to act. Certain men were only accused when they spoke out against the witch trials, against the actions of other men. It could have been a warning: be a good Puritan or look what will happen to you. You'll be accused of being a witch and you will get hung. The Salem witch trials was a tragedy, something you would hope to never see again in society. But humans are odd creatures. We enjoy power, we enjoy control, and it's easy to instill fear in others and turn society against people you don't understand or people who just live differently from you. You think of something like the Salem witch trials being something that could only have happened a few hundred years ago, and that probably is the case when it comes to a literal witch hunt. But there are so many metaphorical witch hunts happening around the world constantly. Anybody who's different, anybody who doesn't follow the crowd, anybody who has different beliefs from you, people are automatically scared. All you need is that trigger, and for the Salem witch trials, the trigger was these teenage girls having these fits. If you want to learn more about interesting events like this throughout history, then make sure you check out Magellan TV. It'll be in the top line of the description down below. Let me know what other historical cases you want me to cover in this series. I have got a very long list, but I'm always looking to add more things to it. Thank you so much for watching. I know I didn't include every single little detail about the Salem witch trials in this video because there is so much about this. So if there's any stories, any details that you think is important about the trials that I didn't share in this video, then leave them in the comments down below and share your knowledge. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.